I want to read an email I got from Diane. She's one of my radio listeners in Iowa. She's married to somebody from the Middle East, and she says, "My husband is so sad when he speaks of what is happening here. He says, I left my homeland, my parents, my culture, my life, because I respected my father. I came here, went to college, learned the language, and gave up my citizenship in Lebanon, and was proud to become an American. Now, my dream of freedom is changing like it did in Lebanon. Once the Muslims are here, they will take more than one wife, because they don't obey our laws, and they will multiply like they did in Lebanon. This is what will happen here in America, and to our children and grandchildren." And then she says, and he says this with tears in his eyes, "Within 40 years, Lebanon went from being over 80% Christian with a Christian government to less than 30% Christian. Lebanon is totally run now by Hezbollah. They control all parts of the government and commerce." That's from a radio listener in Iowa who's married to somebody from Lebanon, and he's really speaking up here.
And the sad fact is, as he uses the illustration of Lebanon, there are so many illustrations of what happens when you allow this Islamic jihadist thinking to spread, and the Western way of thinking always loses on it. In fact, we don't have to speculate what would happen in the United States. We can look at what happened when we brought in the Somali refugees. Was it compassion? We started doing that in the 1980s. We brought in tens of thousands of them. Today, they're breeding terrorists right here in the United States. They're sending terrorists to Syria and other places, and they're living in abject poverty, still in a refugee status, caught, a man without a country, no place to go. It was not compassion to do that to those Somali refugees. And we're going to repeat the same mistakes we made with Somalis.
And I really am with you. I kind of a little bit played devil's advocate for a moment, and why are you opposed to something that sounds so good? And for instance, the National Association of Evangelicals, the NAE, calls for the United States to continue distinguishing between terrorists and the victims of terrorism when deciding refugee policy. And Dr. Leith Anderson goes on to say, of course we want to keep terrorists out of our country, but let's not punish the victims of ISIS for the sins of ISIS. And he goes on to say, we are horrified and heartbroken by the terrorist atrocities in Paris, but must not forget that there are thousands more victims of these same terrorists who are fleeing Syria with their families and desperately need someplace to go. You know very well, Randy White, you've been a Baptist pastor for a long time. Much of the church feels this way, that we must step in when we have the opportunity to play the role of Good Samaritan and also share the gospel.
And the truth is, we're guilted into feeling this way.
And that could be.
As it comes, when you take the mindset that comes from NAE or in Southern Baptist Life, it's the Ethics and Religious Liberties Commission, or on and on, these so-called ethics organizations and social justice organizations that have infiltrated Christianity and so-called evangelicalism, there is a frame of thinking that says we need to erase all borders and be one people without a government, without any kind of protection for the citizenry that we have here, and we need to quit thinking like they would say, like Americans or Western manner of thinking. But I would just propose a Western manner of thinking is called Judeo-Christian values. And we don't need to quit thinking with Judeo-Christian values. We need to begin to say there is a compassion that we have to show to our sons and daughters and our neighbors, and part of that compassion is realizing that God has given the government a role of protecting our people and our borders. And we've got to begin to think, I think, more biblically than this, honestly, bleeding heart kind of liberalism that has come. It's a socialism and a liberalism that has infiltrated the church today.
Dr. White is pastor of the First Baptist Church of Taos, New Mexico. You can learn more at randywhiteministries.org. Had him on air before. We talked to him a few months ago about the difficulty in finding a church, and he writes some very, provocative articles on his website, and I picked up his article on the refugees on his website, randywhiteministries.org. And I think you have an online class. Is it Thursday nights, Randy?
Thursday nights, 8 p.m. Central Time. Always delighted, just verse by verse, word by word, really Bible study.
Great. Okay. I encourage folks to tune in.